The Hammer Podcast will not be heard this month. In its place, we give you the following special presentation. Greetings, and welcome to Legends of the Superheroes, a production of thehammerstrikes.com. My name is Gene Hendricks, and in this show we'll be exploring the live-action appearances of your favorite comic book heroes. I say we because I am joined by a guest. This time out, we have an award-winning webcomic writer, veteran podcaster, driving force behind the book Hey Kids Comics, True Life Tales from the Spinner Rack, and the world's #1 Aquaman fan, Rob Kelly. How are you, Rob?
Hey, Gene, thank you for having me on the inaugural episode of the show. I'm happy to be the Green Arrow or Captain America or George Carlin or whatever you want to call me as the first guest, first new person of the show, of this podcasting venture.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be on. I mean, I've enjoyed your shows for, unfortunately not the entire time you guys have been podcasting, because I only recently found podcasts, but I think that might have broken my brain listening to the 5-hour one, but...
Mission accomplished.
Yes. But this time out, Rob and I will be covering the 1982 Wes Craven movie Swamp Thing, starring Louis Jourdan, Adrienne Barbeau, Ray Wise, and Dick Durock. So, Rob, how did you find this movie? Because I know I saw it on HBO, but I don't remember, exactly when that was.
I saw it in the theater.
Oh, okay.
I saw it in the theater back when, in the very late 70s and early 80s, my father would take my sister and I out my sister didn't live with us because she was older and lived with us, so he would take us out every week, and we would do something different, like go miniature golfing or visit our uncle, or it was something different every week. But movies were always part of the mix, and so growing up, I saw every major movie that a kid would want to see. I saw I saw Raiders, all the Star Wars movies, all the Superman movies. I mean, just everything. It was great. And Swamp Thing, I am sure Swamp Thing was my pick. I'm sure my father had no interest in seeing Swamp Thing. I'm sure he was just like, oh my, really, Swamp Thing? But, I was like, hey, it's a Swamp Thing movie. Because, 1982, comic book movies were still pretty rare to a younger generation. That is completely incomprehensible now, of course. But back then, you had to take what you could get. So I was very excited that there was going to be a Swamp Thing movie. So I remember being in a theater and seeing it.
Oh, wow. So I guess your dad was pleasantly surprised at the bathing scene then?
Well, I guess we should start off with the story is that, there is two cuts of Swamp Thing. There is a 91-minute cut that ran in America, and there's a 93-minute cut which ran in Britain. And the one in Britain has the nudity in it. The one in America does not have the nudity. And I, many years later, when I was toiling away at a video store, we had monitors in the store for to put movies on, and people, the customers could hear them and whatever. And I was one of the managers. And I was there that night. It was like a Friday night, and I was like, I always like to run fun stuff. And I was like, oh, what could I run? And I'm looking through all the tapes, and then there was Swamp Thing. And I was like, wow, I haven't seen Swamp Thing in forever. Let me put that on. So I put it on, and then I go, I'm whatever, and I go off, and I'm putting boxes away or whatever I was doing. And what do I see on the screen but Adrienne Barbeau's naked breast? Like, oops! So I run over and pop the tape out, and I put on whatever else. And I was like, did my dad take me to a movie with nudity in it? Like that, retroactively, my dad was so much cooler. I didn't realize, though, that when they put the movie out on VHS and later on DVD, they used the British version, not the American version. Mm-hmm. So the version that I saw in a theater did not have Adrienne Barbeau topless in it. I wish it had, but it didn't. So, no, my dad... Now, I will say my dad took me to other stuff that did have topless scenes in it, because back then, there's no internet. My dad had no idea. Mm-hmm. We just went to stuff, He took me to Conan the Barbarian. That has nudity in it. But yeah, so the version of Swamp Thing that I saw in the theater was strictly PG, not the PG with a little something extra, the way you see the ones that the Brits saw.
Well, actually, to be fair, I rewatched the one that was broadcast on the IFC network recently. while it's not full frontal, there is some nice images of her bare breasts in there.
Oh yeah.
In fact, it's funny to look, analyzing things like I do. It's almost like the strategically placed branches were strategically placed to say, "Hey, look here," because they weren't hiding anything.
It's an amazing thing to think about that a comic book movie had nudity in it. That's completely incomprehensible nowadays. I mean, if there was nudity in an Iron Man movie, people would just be like, what? It would be so strange. But in the Wes Craven PG-rated Swamp Thing movie, there's not only Adrienne Barbeau topless, but there's that scene at Arcane's lair, or whatever you want to call it, that has like nude dancing girls in it too. So it's very, very strange. It's a very odd mix to have that in what is ostensibly a comic book movie and meant for kids.
Now, this was my first exposure to Swamp Thing as a character. I did not know that there was a comic book prior to this, but I grew up a little bit later, so I think his original comic run was late 60s, early 70s?
It's like 72 to 75, 76.
Oh, was it that late? Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
And then with this movie, they actually started Saga of the Swamp Thing, which eventually led into the Alan Moore world's greatest Swamp Thing stories ever.
Yep.
But you knew that Swamp Thing was a comic book movie coming out?
Oh yeah. I loved Swamp Thing as a kid, and I mean he was from the late 70s to the early 80s, to the very early 80s. He was one of these characters who just didn't have a home and just popped up in DC Comics Presents or Brave and the Bold or whatever. But I always liked him. I always thought he was really cool, and I bought the Saga of the Swamp Thing when it came out. I mean, Saga of the Swamp Thing I think was started entirely because there was the movie. They had optioned the movie, and DC was just like, we want to have a Swamp Thing book out there because there's going to be a movie. So they just started the series because of the movie. And in fact, the cover to Saga of the Swamp Thing #2 is a photo cover of Dick Durock as the Swamp Thing. Oh,
okay. We should be upfront with the listeners. Anyone that has not seen this movie, it is a man in a rubber suit. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
It's not the high-end special effects. It's got a lot of A-team quality stunts, slow motion, flying through the air, etc. But I enjoy it. I really like this movie. Even now, watching it as an adult, I just think that they got just the right balance. They're not trying to be silly. There are silly parts. They're not trying to be serious, but they're not taking it too seriously either.
Yeah, it's a fun B movie. I mean, it's if you look at it from those terms of that, the budget is obviously very low because, as you said, Dick Durock is clearly in a rubber suit with some stuff pasted on him, and then the monsters at the end, But if you look at it from that perspective, I think it's a highly enjoyable, and it's short too. It's like 90 minutes flat, which when something's kind of cheesy, it needs to get in and get out, because before you really start, like, all right, my patience is worn thin here. But the performances are good. I mean, I grew up on Adrienne Barbeau. I still love Adrienne Barbeau. She's just like one of like the childhood crushes I had, as a kid, and still think she's great. And the other Louis Jourdan as Arcane he's not bad, but he was like in his probably 50s when he did it, and I'm sure he knew nothing of Swamp Thing and was just like, oh, this is a comic book? Well, then I'm going to just pitch it to 11. I'm just going to be super, all his dialogue is so dripping with sort of cartoony, kind of line reads. But Dick Durock, is pretty good as Swamp Thing, and Ray Wise as Alec Holland in the beginning is good too. So yeah, I mean, it's a fun, just very simple little monster movie.
Yeah, and I have to say, Ray Wise, until I saw this movie again recently, I completely forgot he was in here. To me, he will always be Leland Palmer from Twin Peaks.
Right.
That was just a brilliant role for him. But you can see a little bit of that here. Like when his sister gets shot and he starts going over the edge, you can see what he was doing in Twin Peaks later on, starting here.
Yeah, he's good. It's a shame. I had read that I as a kid, I never really thought about it, and then later on, I was like, it's kind of odd that they change actors. Like why they make why is it Ray Wise and then it's Dick Durock? And the reason for that is because they apparently intended Ray Wise to be Swamp Thing throughout the whole movie, But when they put the makeup on him, then they compared him to Dick Durock, who was an actor but mostly a stuntman. Mm-hmm. They realized visually they were so different that nobody would buy it. You couldn't intercut the stuntman and the Ray Wise Swamp Thing, and so they just basically handed the entire Swamp Thing role over to Dick Durock, which is kind of remarkable because he was just essentially, I don't want to say just in a pejorative sense, but he was not really an actor. He was a stuntman, and all of a sudden you're handing the title role of your movie to a stuntman. That's pretty remarkable, but I guess they felt like they had no choice.
Yeah, but in this case, I think it worked pretty well because for the first half of the movie, basically, Swamp Thing can't talk.
Right.
And that goes back to the comics, because originally he was, in his first appearance, what was it, House of Mystery?
House of Secrets, number 92.
Okay, House of Secrets. It was one of those houses.
Yeah.
But he couldn't speak at all. All his stuff was in thought balloons. And that's carried through in this movie initially, because he can't talk. He can nod, he can motion, but he can't say anything until later on. Then he just starts saying simple words, and then eventually, by the time you get to the end of the movie, he's completely fluent in English.
Yeah. He's, I mean, if you were trying to make time with Adrienne Barbeau, you'd find yourself inspired to talk as well,
And I have to just give a shout-out to, I'm going to butcher the last name, but Bennett Choate, Choate, the designer of Adrienne Barbeau's gown at the end of the movie.
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Bennett.
Yeah, Wes Craven knew how to make use of Adrienne Barbeau's assets, as it were. I mean, he really knew how to frame them properly, and yeah, I mean, she just looks great. She's one of the. It's weird. It's like she's clearly a sex object in this movie and in other movies, but yet she had a toughness to her that I think undercut she's not a helpless female in this movie. She is in fact she's driving the plot. Really, I mean, I don't know if we want to get into for people who haven't seen it, but just the brief overview of the story. But she's a government agent who shows up in the swamps to Alec and Linda Holland's lab, and they're working with this secret formula that's going to rejuvenate life and whatever, and they realize that it works on plants. And when these bad guys that are the henchmen of Anton Arcane kill Alec Holland and kill Linda Holland to get the formula, it's Abby who drives the story at that point. And as you said, Swamp Thing doesn't have much to say, so he's kind of, he's like the seasoning of the movie. He's lumbering around in the background and occasionally grabbing somebody out of a boat and throwing them around. But it's really Adrienne Barbeau's show. And, so it's as much as the movie highlights, her, ample bosom and stuff, she's a no-nonsense kind of girl. And I think that kind of makes it, a little more palatable as opposed to her just being eye candy.
Oh, yeah, she is definitely not the one that needs to be rescued. Half the time, she's getting away on her own.
Right.
And it's just when she gets cornered to the point where there's no way she can do it, then Swamp Thing shows up and, rips a truck in half or whatever.
Right.
Flips over an airboat. And I have to say, I don't know if he was doing this intentionally. Knowing Wes Craven, he probably was. But there are several shots of Swamp Thing in the movie that look like that Bigfoot footage.
Yeah.
It's a long shot, and he's just lumbering through, and Dick Durock is always holding his head down, like he's looking where he is walking. And it's so much like that old Bigfoot film.
Right.
It's hilarious.
I have to think that's intentional.
Oh, yeah.
You have to.
And you can tell right off with this movie, like you were saying, how she is the government agent coming in, and they're in a swamp. Swamp Thing, it's set in a swamp. They bring her in, and there's the, what's his name? Ritter, the chief of security.
Right.
And it turns out he is actually Arcane in disguise. And what kind of disguise does he have? A rubber Scooby-Doo face mask.
Which we see him pull off. Right.
Exactly. And so you can tell right from that point, it's like, oh, this is just going to be fun, isn't it? It's not serious in the slightest.
Yeah, it's you know, when you look at where Wes Craven's career was at that point, that's certainly his most lighthearted film. And then I think the next film he did after this was Nightmare on Elm Street, which is kind of dark again. So this exists as sort of a weird little blip. I mean, I read online that he partly did this to prove to Hollywood studios that he could do something with a bigger budget and with actual movie stars, and he could make a real movie as opposed to the sort of grubby, nightmarish things that he had done earlier, you know, like A Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes and things like that. So yeah, it is sort of like a strange thing that this is directed by, you know, Wes Craven, really? Swamp Thing? A PG movie called Swamp Thing?
And, you know, it's got a lot of humor in it. There's some action pieces, but there's only so much you can do with Dick Durock in a wetsuit, basically.
Yeah.
But I have to say, my favorite character in the whole movie is Jude, the little kid that runs the gas station. He has the best lines in the whole movie. Like, the bad guys end up showing up when Jude and Cable are in here. They both dive behind the desk, and she tells him not to be afraid. And his line is, "You better say that to someone whose desk you ain't hiding behind."
I generally don't like little kids in movies. I just am like, okay, you know, because they're going to be given cutesy lines or whatever. But yeah, I actually do like him in this movie. There's something about his line readings. They're very relaxed and kind of laconic, and I don't know. I mean, he's clearly meant to be comic relief, but he's not cloying. And if you want to see cloying, watch, or better yet, don't, Return of the Swamp Thing from 1987, which features two little kids in it who you want to just murder. They're so annoying. So, you know, right there, just in the Swamp Thing movie universe, you could see what, you know, a good way to introduce a kind of a younger kid into the movie for comic relief and a bad way to do it.
And I haven't seen Return of the Swamp Thing, although I have seen the TV show.
Oh!
Now, you must remember, when the TV show was on, I was still in school.
Right.
So, I remember it being on USA.
Yeah.
And I remember enjoying it. It wasn't like I must watch this every week kind of show. But I was like, oh, Swamp Thing's on. Great, I'll watch that.
Right.
You know, but I don't remember it being awful. Then again, I haven't seen it in 20 years.
We watched it. That was on while I was at the Kubert School, and we used to get together to watch it, and we just howled with laughter about how bad it was. And there was one where Swamp Thing was tracking somebody. He was following somebody, and he followed the guy all the way to New York. And there's like shots of Swamp Thing skulking around New York City, and we just thought that was the funniest. It was like, taxi, you know, it was just like the funniest thing. Like, why is Swamp Thing in Manhattan? I don't understand. Yeah, I mean, it was clearly successful because it you know, they made two movies, a TV show, and a cartoon series, and a toy line. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's pretty good for you know, for a character who is, you know, not Superman or Batman.
Right. Yeah. In fact, most people don't even realize he is part of DC Comics. I mean, recently he's been more interacting with everything, but even back in the 80s, yeah, you would have references, or you would see, you know, he would cross over a couple times, but for the most part, Swamp Thing wasn't in anything else. I mean, in the 70s he was.
Yeah.
You know, but even that, it was just these one-shot things. You wouldn't read a run of Superman and suddenly, oh, there's Swamp Thing. You know, it was like he was in his own little bubble down in Florida.
The only time they ever did it as an ongoing thing was in the mid-'70s. He became a recurring guest star in Challengers of the Unknown, and it just doesn't fit. You know, you're just like, why is he here? He just doesn't fit. I mean, I remember when he showed up in Crisis, and that was when Alan Moore was doing it, and you're just like, this doesn't fit anymore. You know, like, this Swamp Thing has so become his own thing. It just doesn't. He just looks so strange standing next to all these other characters.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, Swamp Thing really should be off, like, in the Vertigo imprint or something.
Right.
You know, because there's a lot of weirdness there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see. How about we take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a bit more about Swamp Thing.
All right.
Trennis Magnus punches reality. Comics, movies, and TV shows. Trennis Magnus Punches Reality, the People's Geeky Podcast. Trennis Magnus Punches Reality, celebrating 50 ball-smashing episodes. Trennis Magnus Punches Reality, episode 50, coming July 1st, 2014. Only at twotruefreaks.com. I'm not kidding around either. If I ever find out my show's been syndicated on some other podcast network without my permission, I'll sue a motherfucker.
Hey, Gene, we should do a podcast.
Sounds like a great idea, Jeff. But what will we talk about?
How about a superhero that we both love?
Perfect. Something like Thor or Captain America?
Both great choices, but I think they're being covered by somebody else already.
Wait, I've got it. What about the Protector of the Universe?
Like Voltron?
No. The guy with the jewelry that lets him create whatever he wants.
Green Lantern, nice.
Close. No, this guy has cosmic awareness.
Captain Marvel?
Almost. I mean, Quasar.
Quasar. Who doesn't love a good Quasar?
Tune in to the Quantum Cast, covering all things Quasar.
Yes, that's right. You can find us at quantumbands.blogspot.com.
And on the Two True Freaks Internet Radio Network.
Yeah, that didn't sound scripted at all, did it?
Coming soon on Two True Freaks.
Beware the beast man,
A month-long celebration
for he is the devil's pawn,
of one of the greatest science fiction series
alone among God's primates.
of all time.
He kills for sport, or lust, or greed.
Covering all the films,
Let him not breed in great numbers, for he will make a desert of his home and yours.
all the comic books,
Shun him,
the toys,
drive him back into his jungle lair,
the entire phenomenon that was
for he is the harbinger of death.
the Planet of the Apes. Planet of the Apes, a month-long event, coming soon, only at twotruefreaks.com.
And we're back.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that I do like about Swamp Thing, and again, in its cheesiness, is that it does have kind of a nice heart to it, and it has a little bit of a, I don't want to oversell this, because it's, but like a philosophical point of view, because they establish later on, and spoiler alert for a 30-year-old movie, but like they establish that the formula that the Alec Holland has come up with doesn't so much turn you into like a super being as it brings out what is latent in you. So it's like if you're a heroic person or a courageous person or a selfless person, it brings that out and it sort of gives you the ability to be that times a 10 or times 100. So it's like Alec Holland is a nice guy and he's mixed with all the swamp gick and it turns him into a hero. Now, later on in the movie, when, spoiler alert, when Anton Arcane takes the formula, it turns him into just a horrible monster. In an even worse monster suit. I mean, you could practically see the zipper going up the back. It's so bad. But, like, it turns him into just a raving, monstrous, mindless creature. So, it's establishing, like, okay, this guy is a horrible person. The formula is not going to turn him into something great. It's going to turn him into just magnify what he already is. And earlier on, Arcane tests the formula on one of his henchmen, and it turns him into like a little person, like a person with like a pig snout, and it sort of deforms him a little, but it turns him into kind of like a nice guy. Like he then befriends Swamp Thing and Abby because he realizes, I've been betrayed by my boss. I'm going to help out, Swamp Thing and the other guys. And there is a scene in the movie where Swamp Thing loses his arm, gets chopped off, and he's trussed up down in the dungeon, and he's, there with just the one arm, but he manages to get a little bit of sunlight shown on him, and he starts regrowing his arm. which is great, which is like something inherent in the character from the beginning, his ability to regenerate. And it's done very, very cheesily because, again, they had very little money. Basically, they stuck a twig in Swamp Thing's arm, and then you see it, they keep cutting back to it, and it's growing and growing and growing. But I still thought that was neat. They're like, oh, cool, they're bringing that from the comic book in as well. I mean, it's like, it's a cheesy movie with low budget, but they're in there trying. And it's like, I can forgive a movie it's low budget if they're really trying to, you could tell they're really trying to do something, as opposed to trying to get one over on you or whatever. Like, they really are, they're in there pitching. And apparently, again, from what I read, is that Wes Craven took on this movie and the budget was much higher, and then they kept cutting it. So Wes Craven had to keep cutting corners further and further to make the movie.
And you can tell.
And you can tell. And funnily enough, this is produced by Melkner and Uzlan, who later on would produce Batman in 1989. So it's like they were, establishing their comic book movie bona fides, 7 years earlier. And it's amazing to think that those two films are only separated by 7 years, and yet they're like completely different universes in terms of how they feel. I mean, Batman, the 1989 Batman movie could not have been a bigger event movie. It could not have been. And yet Swamp Thing is like this little grungy, little release. It's sort of remarkable.
Yeah, and like you were saying with the budget, you can almost tell right when the accountants came in, because the arcane creature. I'm pretty sure I had that mask as a kid for Halloween, because it doesn't move. The eyes are painted on.
Yeah, it's a horrible. Yeah.
I mean, they don't destroy that thing quick enough, really.
The other thing that's odd is that, like, the whole movie is shot during the day. All the scenes take place during the day. And you would think that if you have cheesy rubber suits, you would shoot more scenes at night, to hide it more. I mean, first of all, to give yourself some extra mood, but just to also hide the costumes more. If the lights are off, it's harder to make out that, oh, look at that. You can tell the little rubber creases on people's elbows and stuff. So that's kind of a strange thing that virtually the entire movie is shot during the day.
Yeah, and at least put a blue filter on it or something. Pretend it's night.
Yeah,
like
right.
In the
shoot
50s.
Day for night. Yeah, shoot day for night. That's very strange. There apparently is a commentary track on the DVD from Wes Craven, and I want to find that and listen to it, because he probably has some really interesting stories about shooting it. I just have never gotten around to buying it, but I would almost buy a DVD of Swamp Thing just to hear Wes Craven talk about it. There's probably some really interesting stories. And, one of the things I loved about Swamp Thing when it was coming out is the poster. The poster is gorgeous, this beautiful painting, which is set at night, oddly enough, of Swamp Thing coming through the swamp, and he's holding Adrienne Barbeau, who looks just they made her boobs even bigger in the painting, which is not surprising. But the painting is just like a classic movie poster painting, and it ran on the inside covers of like every DC comic for like 3 months, and I remember seeing them like going, oh man, I can't wait to see this movie. It looks so cool.
All right, well, I'm pretty sure that for the movie it's what, 32 years old now. Now I really feel old.
You feel old? I just said that I saw it in the theater.
I wasn't going to go that far, but if you wanted to bring it up, sure.
It was plate night. It was wonderful. Roosevelt told us to go see to the movies, like, oh my God. There was a newsreel, there was a cartoon, it was great.
All right, well, I think we're going to wrap it up on that note, as Rob gets his wheelchair and goes out. Well, thank you again for being here, Rob. I really appreciate it. And why don't you tell the people where they can find you on the internet and on the airwaves?
On the airwaves, of course, is the Fire and Water podcast, which you can find on iTunes and Stitcher, and on our blog, which is fireandwaterpodcast.blogspot.com. And I, of course, run the Aquaman Shrine, which is aquamanshrine.net. And as Gene very generously mentioned, there's my book, Hey Kids Comics, True Life Tales from the Spinner Rack, which is available on Amazon. And there's also my web comic, which is Ace Kilroy, which you can find online at acekilroy.com in print form and on Comixology in digital form.
And I would suggest that everyone listening to this check all those things out, especially Hey Kids Comics and Ace Kilroy. They are both excellent productions.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rob, and thank you for listening, everyone. I'll catch you next time. Legends of the Superheroes is a production of thehammerstrikes.com and focuses on examining live-action versions of superheroes. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please send an email to legends@thehammerstrikes.com. Please look for The Hammer Strikes on Facebook and Google+. Part of the Two True Freaks Internet Radio Network.
I should have mentioned on the show, it's like, for anybody who's listening to the show for the first time, the guests can only get better from here. So if you got through this episode, the rest are going to be down. It's all going to be easy. So.
Well, now I know what to put after the credits.
Ah, perfect. Okay.